Hello and welcome. My name is Biagio Mazza, Pastoral Associate at St. Sabina Parish in Belton, Missouri, and I'm here to welcome you to another Do You Know series question. Today's Do You Know question is, do you know the scriptural background to the Feast of Pentecost? In order to understand this, it's important to first know that the time sequence that we have for the Feast of Pentecost, which is second only to the Feast of Easter, is established by Luke in his Acts of the Apostles. Luke has Jesus spend 40 days on earth and then ascends to heaven on the Feast of the Ascension. And then he spreads out another 10 days of waiting and praying for the descent of the Spirit, which Jesus had promised. So Pentecost, we celebrate the descent of the Spirit upon the apostles. It's the official close of the season of Easter. But it's important to also know that Pentecost was a Jewish feast and still is a Jewish feast. It's one of 3 pilgrimage feasts. The Jewish name for it can be the Feast of Shavuot or the Feast of Weeks, 7 weeks of weeks. In which Thanksgiving for the Exodus and for the many things that happened during the Easter season are celebrated on the Feast of Pentecost. So the feast is actually one of 3 pilgrimage feasts in the Jewish tradition. The first feast was the pilgrimage feast, is the Feast of Exodus. Then we had the Feast of Pentecost exactly 50 days later. And then we had the Feast of Booths, or Sukkot, harvest time in the fall. During these 3 festal times, Jews who were able to were encouraged to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem to connect with the Lord. And as it was typical in regards to Jewish feasts, each of the feasts was also associated with an agricultural event. So the Exodus was associated first as the barley harvest, the celebration of the barley harvest, as well as the freedom from slavery in the Exodus experience, freedom from slavery from Egypt. Pentecost would celebrate the agricultural feast of the harvest wheat, the first harvest wheat, and the feast that was associated with that was the covenant established on Mount Sinai, as well as the celebration of the law that was given on Mount Sinai. And finally, the Feast of Booths or Sukkot celebrated the fall harvest festival, along with the feast of commemorating the travel, the wandering of the Jews for 40 years in the desert, where Jews to this very day even built little tents outside and sleep outside looking at the moon and the sun and the stars and so on. So why did Luke choose the Feast of Pentecost to commemorate the descent of the Spirit on the apostles and on Jesus' followers? Well, it seems that many of the elements that were associated with the giving of the law on Mount Sinai and the establishment of the covenant are what the elements that Luke sees as being crucial in the descent of the Spirit. Elements like loud sounds, a mighty wind, fire, were all elements of the giving of the law on Mount Sinai, and Luke sees them as elements common in the descent of the Spirit which Jesus promised. The Spirit actually empowers the followers of Jesus, directing them to go out and carry out the mission and ministry of Jesus, similar to the law, which gave direction to Jewish people's relationship to God. And so Luke uses Pentecost as that backdrop to understand the coming of the Spirit and the role that the Spirit plays in the lives of the followers of Jesus. One last story that Luke connects with the Feast of Pentecost is the Tower of Babel story in Genesis 11. That story actually has the confusion of languages as an explanation for how that story develops and explains the confusion of language. Luke uses the occasion of the descent of the Spirit to undo Babel, essentially saying that the language of the Spirit is universal language that everybody understands. And therefore, the Spirit is the one that enables us to understand one another and connect with one another, unlike Babel. And what is that language of the Spirit? The language of the Spirit, the universal language that everybody understands, is the language of love, care, and concern for one another. And so Luke uses both to indicate to us the presence and the power of the Spirit that is effective in our lives even to this very day. First of all, connecting it with the Jewish feast, in which the giving of the law and the coming of the Spirit all were intended to direct us in our relationship with God and embolden us in proclaiming the message of the Lord in our midst. And secondly, the story of the Tower of Babel, which undoes Babel, the diffusion of languages, to a unity of language of the Spirit that everyone can understand, the language of love, care, and concern for one another. So I hope this has helped just a bit to explore the scriptural background to the Feast of Pentecost, and I hope you will come again to more Do You Know questions to explore our faith and our scriptural tradition. Thank you very much.